Edmund Hartley had destroyed careers with his reviews. He was the most powerful music critic in America, and he hated Elvis Presley. So when he got invited onto the Steve Allen Show in 1956, he came prepared to humiliate the young rock star on live television. His weapon? Oh, Sole Mio, an Italian opera song so technically difficult that even trained opera singers struggled with it. He handed Elvis the sheet music and smirked. "Sing this if you can." What happened next wiped the smirk off his face and made him resign from his job the next day. Edmund Hartley wasn't just any critic. He wrote for the New York Times. He'd been trained at Juilliard. He considered himself a guardian of real music, which to him meant classical, opera, jazz performed by serious musicians in serious venues. He saw rock and roll as a cancer, a degradation of American culture, and Elvis Presley as the disease's most visible symptom. Hartley had written multiple columns about Elvis, each more scathing than the last. He called Elvis a wiggling, gyrating embarrassment. He said Elvis's voice was adequate for county fairs but insulting to anyone with actual musical training. He wrote that Elvis represented the death of sophistication and the triumph of the lowest common denominator. These weren't just reviews, they were personal attacks, dripping with contempt and class snobbery. The producers of The Steve Allen Show knew about Hartley's hatred for Elvis. That's why they invited him as a guest on the same episode where Elvis was scheduled to perform. It was a ratings goldmine. Elvis was the biggest sensation in America, appearing on the show to perform Hound Dog and promote his new records. Having his biggest critic there would create tension, controversy, and most importantly, viewers. What the producers didn't know was that Edmund Hartley had a plan. He wasn't just going to sit there and critique Elvis after his performance. He was going to expose him as a fraud on live television in front of millions of Americans. The show started normally enough. Steve Allen did his monologues, some comedy sketches, and then introduced Elvis. Elvis performed Hound Dog. Though famously, Steve Allen made him sing it to an actual basset hound as a joke, trying to make Elvis look silly. Elvis handled it with good humor, but you could see in his eyes that he didn't appreciate being treated like a novelty act. After Elvis's performance, Steve Allen brought out Edmund Hartley. The audience applauded politely, though most of them had no idea who this serious-looking man in the expensive suit was. Steve introduced him as one of America's most distinguished music critics and asked him what he thought of Elvis's performance. Hartley didn't hold back. "Mr. Allen, what I just witnessed wasn't music. It was a spectacle. Mr. Presley is very good at spectacle. He shakes his hips, he has good stage presence, teenage girls scream. But let's be honest about what this is. It's not artistry. It's not musicianship. It's marketing." The audience murmured uncomfortably. This wasn't the playful banter they were used to on variety shows. This was an attack. Steve Allen tried to lighten the mood, but Hartley wasn't done. "You want to know the difference between a real musician and Mr. Presley?" Hartley continued. "A real musician has training, has technique, can read music, can perform across multiple genres. Mr. Presley can shake his hips to a backbeat. That's not the same thing." Elvis, sitting on the couch next to Steve Allen's desk, remained quiet. His jaw was tight, but he wasn't going to lose his temper on live television. He'd been taught better than that. That's when Edmund Hartley made his move. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out several sheets of paper, sheet music. He walked over and handed them to Elvis. "This is O Sole Mio," Hartley said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's an Italian opera song written in 1898. It requires real vocal technique, breath control, an understanding of classical composition. It's the kind of thing real singers perform." He paused for effect. "If you're truly a musician, Mr. Presley, and not just a good-looking young man who got lucky, you should be able to sight-read this and perform it right now, on this stage, for America." The audience gasped. This was an ambush, and everyone knew it. Steve Allen looked at his producers in the wings, unsure how to handle this. This wasn't in the script, but they were live, and there was nothing they could do. Elvis looked down at the sheet music. His face was unreadable. The camera zoomed in on him, and 15 million Americans watching at home held their breath. This was either going to be the most embarrassing moment in television history, or something else entirely. "You want me to sing this? Right now?" Elvis asked quietly. If you can, Hartley said with that same condescending smirk. But I understand if you can't. Not everyone has real training. There's no shame in admitting you're just an entertainer, not a musician. What Edmund Hartley didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that Elvis had been taking voice lessons since he was a teenager. Not from any famous teacher, not at any prestigious school, but from a woman named Miss Maud in Tupelo, Mississippi, who had studied opera in Europe before retiring to teach voice in the small towns of the South. Elvis's mother, Gladys, had used some of the little money they had to pay for those lessons. She believed her son had a gift and she wanted him to develop it properly. Miss Maud taught Elvis breath control, taught him how to support notes from his diaphragm, taught him the classical techniques that opera singers used. Elvis never talked about those lessons because it didn't fit his image. Rock and roll was supposed to be raw, instinctive, rebellious. Admitting he had classical training would make him seem calculated, manufactured. But sitting there on the Steve Allen Show, holding sheet music for one of the most challenging songs in the classical repertoire, with Edmund Hartley's smirk burning into him and millions of people waiting to see him fail, Elvis made a decision. He was going to show them what he could really do. I'll sing it, Elvis said, standing up, but I'm going to need the band to follow me, not the other way around. Steve Allen, sensing this might actually be interesting, quickly gathered the show's orchestra. The musical director, a man named Skitch Henderson, looked at the sheet music and then at Elvis with concern. Son, this is really difficult. Are you sure you want to attempt this? Yes, sir, Elvis said simply. The studio audience was silent. You could feel the tension in the room. Edmund Hartley sat back down, arms crossed, that smirk still on his face. He was about to watch his nemesis crash and burn on live television. This was going to be the vindication he'd been waiting for. Elvis stepped up to the microphone. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, something had changed. The hip-shaking rock and roller was gone. In his place was someone else, someone most of America had never seen. A serious artist about to attempt something that could destroy his career if he failed. Skitch Henderson counted off, and the orchestra began the introduction to Sole Mio. It's a beautiful song, but unforgiving. The melody soars, demanding incredible breath control and perfect pitch. The lyrics are in Italian, requiring precise pronunciation. It's the kind of song that separates trained vocalists from amateurs in the first few bars. Elvis began to sing, and the studio went completely silent, not the polite silence of people watching a performance, the stunned silence of people witnessing something they never expected. His voice was completely different from his rock and roll performances. This wasn't the Elvis who sang Hound Dog or Blue Suede Shoes. This was a voice that had been trained, refined, developed over years of practice. His breath control was perfect. His pronunciation of the Italian lyrics was flawless. But more than the technical perfection, there was emotion. He wasn't just hitting the notes correctly, he was making them mean something. The camera caught Edmund Hartley's face. The smirk was gone. His mouth was slightly open. He looked like a man watching his entire worldview collapse in real time. Elvis continued through the song, his voice building to the famous climax. O Sole Mio requires the singer to hold a high note while the orchestra swells behind them. It's a moment that can make or break the performance. Elvis held that note, pure and strong and beautiful, for what seemed like forever. The orchestra built around him, and when he finally released the note and moved into the final phrase, there were tears visible on his face, not from strain, but from emotion. This wasn't just a performance for him. This was vindication. This was proof of all those lessons with Miss Maud, all those hours his mother sacrificed, all the work he'd done that nobody knew about. When Elvis finished, the final note hanging in the air, there was absolute silence for about 3 seconds. Then, the studio audience exploded. People were on their feet, screaming, crying, applauding. The orchestra members were standing, clapping. Even the camera operators had stopped working properly, the shots going shaky as they tried to applaud and work at the same time. Steve Allen stood up, mouth open in shock. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said when the applause finally died down, enough for him to speak, "I think we just witnessed television history." The camera found Edmund Hartley. He wasn't applauding. He was just sitting there, his face pale, looking at Elvis like he was seeing him for the first time. Steve Allen, being a good host, walked over to him. "Well, Mr. Hartley, what do you think now? Does Mr. Presley qualify as a real musician?" Hartley didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I was wrong." He stood up on shaky legs and walked over to Elvis. The audience went quiet again, everyone wondering what was about to happen. "Mr. Presley," Hartley said, his voice breaking slightly, "I owe you an apology, a profound apology. I thought I knew what music was. I thought I understood what made someone a real artist. But I was just a snob with a title, protecting my own narrow little world." He extended his hand. "You're not just a musician. You're one of the finest vocalists I've ever heard, and I'm ashamed of every word I wrote about you." Elvis shook his hand. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." The show ended shortly after, but the impact of what had happened rippled out immediately. By the next morning, every newspaper in America was talking about it. The clip of Elvis singing "O Sole Mio" became one of the most requested pieces of footage in television history. Within a week, classical music radio stations were playing it. Opera critics were writing columns analyzing Elvis's technique. And Edmund Hartley? He resigned from the New York Times 3 days later. His resignation letter was published, and in it, he wrote, "I have spent my career claiming to be an arbiter of musical excellence while actually being an arbiter of my own prejudices. Last night, Elvis Presley taught me that genius doesn't care about genre, that artistry doesn't respect the boundaries I tried to build around it. I am not qualified to judge music anymore because I have proven that I cannot recognize it when it's standing right in front of me." The letter was unprecedented. Critics didn't admit they were wrong, especially not publicly. But Hartley was different after that night. He later wrote a book about music and prejudice, using his own experience with Elvis as the central example of how bias can blind us to greatness. Elvis never talked much about that performance in interviews. When people asked him about it, he'd usually deflect, say something humble about just trying his best. But people close to Elvis said it was one of the moments he was most proud of, not because he embarrassed a critic, but because he got to show the world what his mother had believed in all along, that he wasn't just a rock and roll singer. He was a musician in every sense of the word. Miss Maud, the voice teacher from Tupelo, was watching that night. She was in her 70s by then, still teaching kids in Mississippi. When people asked her about Elvis the next day, she smiled and said, "I always knew he could do it. That boy had a gift from God, and he worked harder than anyone I ever taught to develop it. The world just needed to see what I already knew." The performance of O Sole Mio did something important beyond just vindicating Elvis. It challenged the cultural snobbery that said certain kinds of music were serious and others weren't. It proved that someone could be a brilliant rock and roller and a classically trained vocalist at the same time, that you didn't have to choose between popular and prestigious. That maybe, just maybe, the arbitrary lines people drew between genres were meaningless in the face of real talent. Years later, opera singers would cite Elvis's performance as inspiration. Classical musicians would talk about the importance of not dismissing popular music. Music schools would use the clip as an example of how technique and emotion could combine perfectly. And Edmund Hartley's resignation letter became required reading in journalism ethics classes as an example of the importance of admitting when you're wrong. But the real legacy of that night was simpler than all that. A young man from Mississippi who'd been told his whole life that he wasn't good enough, that his music wasn't real music, that he was just a lucky kid with good looks, stood on a stage and proved that prejudice is no match for preparation. That talent, real talent, can't be confined to the boxes people try to put it in. Edmund Hartley came to humiliate Elvis Presley. Instead, Elvis taught him, and America, a lesson about humility, talent, and the danger of dismissing something just because it doesn't fit your narrow definition of art. O Sole Mio means my son in English. And on that night in 1956, Elvis Presley's light shone so bright that even his biggest critic had to shield his eyes and admit he'd been looking at a star all along.